Okay, great. Well, good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Becky. I'm the Chief Exec of the English Association. I'm really pleased to be hosting the session this afternoon about crossing the arts and science divide in schools, which is a topic really close to my heart. I find it personally very interesting, so it's a treat for me to be here. So thank you very much to Rebecca and Sharon for having me and being along and speaking to us this afternoon. Just a quick word about the English Association, who we are and what we do. We're a learning society and a subject association, which was founded in 1906 to promote, support, and celebrate the discipline of English studies from primary and early years through to secondary and further education to higher education and beyond. And we support teachers and practitioners in English across all parts of the discipline, across language, linguistics, literature, and creative writing. Events like the one this afternoon are made possible by the brilliant contribution of our volunteer speakers. So thank you again to Rebecca and Sharon for giving us your time so generously. Our members also make it possible to keep these events free and open to all. So if you enjoy the event today and you want to join us again, please do think about becoming a member and helping support our discipline. From the 1st of September, you can join us until December for as little as £9. And then from January 26, it will cost from just £29 to support our events, campaigning and advocacy work for a whole year, and you get access to a range of member benefits, including online access to all our journals. But that's enough for me. So I'm going to hand over to this afternoon's speakers for our discussion. Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you ever so much, Becky, for asking us to come. We really appreciate it. I can see that there's a message from Estelle, which I have no way of replying to. So just to say that's no problem, Estelle. And it's really nice that you're here anyway. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Davy Notebooks Project itself. And then Rebecca is going to talk about the teaching resources that have been developed to go with them. And Becky is very kindly going to show the slides as well. So here we are. For the past 4 years, well, between 2019 and 2024, actually finished last year, more than 3,500 volunteers from around the world have been trying to decipher what Sir Humphry Davy, in slide 2, there he is, wrote in his notebooks 200 years ago. The notebooks are held at the Royal Institution in London, and we were able to digitise them and then ask people to transcribe them for us and write notes to their transcriptions. So Humphry Davy, I imagine lots of you all know this, isolated more chemical elements than anyone else has before or since, but he's perhaps best known for the miner's safety lamp that he developed, a wire mesh lamp, which became known as the Davy lamp. He was also the first person to inhale nitrous oxide, which is something I imagine school kids find quite fascinating. He also wrote poetry throughout his life, though hardly any of this poetry has ever been published. So the next slide, thank you, Becky, gives some stats on the project. So there you can see the number of volunteers, and there were 129 notebooks or sets of lecture notes that we transcribed. It came to more than 13,000 pages in the end. And we also asked people to research the things that they came across and tell us about them. So if there were people or places or chemical elements or something like this, then the volunteers would kind of do some research and we'd write a note to them. So you can see these in the finished version, which is there. You can see the website there, digital collections at Lancaster AC UK. So the notebooks show that Davy wrote poetry in his laboratory. I think this is the thing that's most interesting, perhaps to me, is that he would be doing chemical experiments and then he would dash off a few lines of poems. And then you can see this because the pages themselves are burned and torn from the chemical experiments that he's doing. And so, yes, I think that he's kind of looking at the world in two different ways, through poetry and science, on the same page of the same notebook. So Davy was friends with a number of early 19th century poets and writers. He's very integrated into the literary scene, including Mary Shelley's dad, William Godwin. And we know from Mary Shelley's journal that she was reading what she called Davy's chemistry when she was writing her famous novel Frankenstein. Indeed, Davy's 1802 Discourse Introductory to a Course of Lectures finds its way almost word for word into the inspirational speech given to the young Victor Frankenstein by his university tutor, Professor Waldman. There's much evidence to suggest that Shelley had Davy in mind when she came up with the character Victor Frankenstein. So I've written lots more about this in various different places, but particularly in a book that I published in 2021 called The Science of Life and Death in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which you can read if you want to follow that up. But I'm particularly interested because there might be teachers here who are teaching Frankenstein on the AQA curriculum, or in any case, I think lots of teachers teach a bit of Frankenstein in their romantics modules as well. We could talk about this more in the questions. So I'm going to tell you a bit about the project then. If we could move on to the next slide, please, Becky. So this was the platform that we used. They're called Zooniverse. They do amazing projects, and when I retire, I'm going to just do projects on Zooniverse because they just look so interesting, and lots of different, a real range of things. They started with astronomy projects, and then it was things that humans could do that AI couldn't do. I imagine this is changing all the time now, but there were images of the night sky, and you had to kind of point to different things that were in the images. But they've actually got so many different kinds of things, and we were their first. Not their first transcription project, but their longest transcription project. So it was actually the biggest kind of one that they'd done. And the next slide shows us what our page looked like on Zooniverse. It's still there. You can still see it. And then I was going to show you in the next slide the covers of some of Davy's notebooks. So this is what we were dealing with. He kept his notebooks throughout his career. And as I said, there's 129 of these, or kind of, some of them are just lecture notes. So they're kind of pages sort of clipped together. Not all of them have got covers like this. Some of them are very beautiful objects, but obviously they are kind of fragile and 200 years old. And so it was a great thing to be able to digitize them and to find out what was really in them, because some people have kind of used them for biographies of Davy and things like that, but no one's really actually transcribed the whole thing from start to finish, which is what we've done now. So I think people really liked the transcription work because there's a real generic mix in Davy's notebooks. So I'm going to kind of run through the next few slides, if that's okay with you, Becky. There are lots of doodles you can see in the next one here. That's a centurion that he's doodling and other things. There are sketches in the next one. Some really beautiful sketches, even some watercolors, as you can see in the next slide. There are landscapes showing geological features. So the next slide shows you High Force, which is in the northeast, and he was obviously very interested in geology. He was also one of the people that started the British Geological Association as well. There are lots of faces drawn in profile on the next slide. You can see some of these. We have not managed to identify who these people are at all, which is annoying. But there we are, still mysteries to be found. And there are sums, as you can see in the next slide, loads of sums as well, which we've also transcribed. There was one whole notebook, which was a maths notebook, and we had to ask an expert on the history of maths to help us with that one because it was just so difficult to understand. But so Davy uses notebooks, as we all do, to record who he owns money to, his travel budget, or to give calculations related to his chemical experiments. But there's also reading lists, shopping lists, gossip about his contemporaries, philosophical musings, and the list goes on, particularly late in his life, when Davy is traveling around Europe for his health. He uses the notebook as a kind of diary for, he keeps taking the temperature of the room, lots of stuff about the treatments he's undergoing, like leeches and things like that. Really much more interesting personal stuff, I guess, by that point as well. So in a survey that we did at the end of the pilot project, we discovered that our transcriber demographic was predominantly over 65 years old, lots of people who are retired, followed by the 45 to 54-year age range after that. And most of them had a postgraduate degree. So our volunteers, we found out, had been teachers, medical professionals, librarians, civil servants, industrial chemists, and all sorts of other roles. And everyone who contributed to the project brought their own particular skill and experience set. Some had spent hours of every day helping us over a period of many years. Some are still helping me now, which is quite amazing. So the next slide shows you how the transcription worked. So you get a line, you get a page of text, you draw a line under one line of the text, and then you'd write in what you think it was. And we try to get people to do it exactly as it was on the page. So if Davy made a spelling mistake, then you would make that spelling mistake as well. And every line was done at least 3 times by volunteers. So if I said there were over 13,000 pages, so many lines per page, and each line of that was done by 3 people. So that's an awful lot of work that's gone into it. And then all of it is checked by one of the project team as well. We used the Zooniverse tool to aggregate the 3 lines to see what the aggregate was. And then you could see whether a lot of people had agreed or disagreed, and the project team would go in and have a look and see what they thought. So although we knew that Davy had written poetry beforehand, we had no idea that we'd find so much poetry in the notebooks. There are hundreds of poems, many of which demonstrate Davy's interest in science can be found in his poetic writing. So now that the notebooks are published, I'm co-editing Davy's poetry for an open access edition with UCL Press. You'll be able to read that probably at the end of next year. And I've recently been editing Davy's poems that were published in the annual anthology. So I've noticed references to his galvanic experiments in his poem Song of Pleasure, as well as scientific knowledge displayed in his mention of red lightnings in The Tempest. And repeated in a number of poems is Davy's desire to, quote, scan the laws of nature, meaning that he wanted to identify and monitor the principles of the natural world. I've been newly and increasingly surprised by the range of scientific language in his poetry while doing this work. And it's also true that Davy's scientific writing can be seen as poetic in its style and range of reference. When he lectured at the Royal Institution, his lectures were so popular that Albemarle Street became the first one-way street in London because there were so many carriages trying to get down the street. Coleridge went to Davy's first lectures saying that he used them to add to the stock of his metaphors for his poetry. We have loads of lecture notes among the manuscripts that we've transcribed, and you can read all of this on the Davy Notebooks Project website, which I urge you all to go and have a look at. You can search for words and topics and have a look find them in both Davy's science and his poetry. So, as I say, for Davy, these 2 methods, science and poetry, were both ways of exploring the world. And today, when we increasingly keep the 2 separate, whether at school, at university, or even in our hobbies, he is an excellent reminder of the time when there was no need to do so. So one thing we did was to ask STEM Learning, who are a company that work with the government a lot, based in York, to come up with some teaching resources from these the Davy Notebooks materials that we had, and Estelle actually helped us with these as well. And Rebekah is now going to talk about that, those resources for this project. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Sharon, for that introduction. I'm Rebekah. I was one of the research assistants on the Davy Notebooks project, so I did a lot of that transcription checking and writing annotations and checking annotations and making Sharon mentioned before. And I've also worked with the STEM learning resources and gone into school to deliver those. So I'm just going to take you through those now, starting with where to find them and the ways in which they can be used. I've got some slides. Here we go. So this is the first slide, basically saying you can find the resources at www.stem.org.uk. So you can either follow the link on the slide. I think Becky's going to circulate the slides at the end of the session, or you can just go to the website and search for them. If you just type in Humphry Davy, they'll come up. You need to make an account to download, but that's free. And once you've downloaded them, you have everything that you need. So can you get the next slide, please, Becky? So in the resources, there are full teacher guidance notes, including lesson plans for all the lessons, presentations and worksheets for a total of 3 lessons, 2 English and 1 science. There's different ways to do it. I'll talk a bit about that later. 2 videos introducing Davy, a knowledge prompt sheet on the science, links to further information on Davy and the Davy Notebooks project, and a full transcript of Davy's poem Many Years Have Passed, which is what a lot of the lessons are based around. So the resources were designed with Key Stage 3 in mind, but they also work really well for Key Stage 4. I delivered them to a group of high ability year 10s with only minor adaptations, and they were pitched about right for the end of the summer term. They also still tie into aspects of the curriculum for Key Stage 4. So the poetry analysis skills obviously help with the unseen poetry component, and it helps them to revise and apply key concepts that they're doing in science, particularly physics. Can I get the next slide, please, Becky? So the resources are quite flexible. Obviously, some of the tasks can be modified for different abilities, be delivered in different formats to suit different timetables. So there's 3 50-minute lessons, and you can either do it as 2 English lessons and 1 science lesson, so English, science, English, or you can condense it down into 2 lessons essentially. If you are doing that, I would usually recommend doing the science lesson first, but teachers, you will know what's going to work best with your own students. Can I get the next slide, please? So I'm going to talk through the resources now. English lesson 1, as you can see on the slide from the learning outcomes and things, is quite a straightforward poetry analysis lesson based on Davy's Many Days Have Passed. The focus is mainly on the opening stanza of the poem, but I would advise getting the pupils to read through the whole poem at this stage, so they can get a sense of it kind of in context. It is quite a good poem. I wouldn't, Sharon might disagree with me, but I wouldn't say all of Davy's poems are technically accomplished. I would say try and talk as little about Davy himself as possible in this lesson, because that will spoil the starter for the science lesson. But obviously, if you're doing a science then English format, they'll already know all about him, so don't worry about it. The lesson's really mapped out in the resources. There's a suggested analysis of the whole poem. But again, you will probably have your own ways of going through a poem with a class, and that wouldn't disrupt the rest of the resources in any way. I'm not going to read you the whole poem that we work with, but as the first stanza is the focus of the 3 lessons, I am going to read that now. So I think that's on the next slide. Many days have passed, beloved scenes, since last my wet eyes saw the moonbeams gild thy whitely foaming waves. Ambitious then, confiding in her powers, spurning the prison. So the resources in the first lesson ask students to respond with an initial impression of the lines. Then it goes on to highlight certain words, which I've got on the next slide. There's options for what to do with the words. The resources provide activities based in both images or definitions, which you can match up to students. You can get them to write their own definitions. Again, this is flexible. You could choose other words in the text if you wanted. I'd advise keeping in gild and whitely foaming as they come up again in the science lesson. But apart from that, you can adapt them to the needs of your class. And basically, this lesson centers around getting pupils to write a short analysis of the opening lines. And there's a model answer included for that. If you're doing 1 English lesson and 1 science lesson, these activities can be condensed, so you're analysing the poem in less detail, the poem as a whole. And if they've already had the science lesson, I found the difficulty was steering them towards writing a more traditional Englishy answer for this bit. So that's something to bear in mind for your structures. On the next slide, I've got the learning outcomes and stuff for the science lesson. So pupils will need to know about waves, reflection, white light, and the moon. But the resources have a prompt sheet on these just in case. Can I have the next slide as well, please? This lesson, it does work well as revision for these topics if pupils are already familiar with them from science, but it would also work well as a plenary at the end of a series of lessons talking about light and waves. So if you are working closely with the science department, that's something to think about in terms of timing. So the lesson opens with this on the next slide. It's an image of Davy and a selection of other images, and it asks people to kind of look at the pictures, guess what he's famous for. You know, some prompts to help get them going. Then there's one of the videos which introduces Davy and his work. So the key thing here is for the video and the teacher to explain sort of a lot of what Sharon was talking about before, where how in Davy's notebooks we find the poetry and the other writings like right next to the records of the experiments and the lecture notes and all the other kinds of writing. That is the bit that I also find really cool. And I think that might be something we end up returning to in the discussion. Can I have the next slide, please? The science lesson then goes back to the opening stanza of Many Days Has Passed. And if you're doing just one science lesson and one English lesson, you don't need to go through the whole poem here. But again, like in the first English lesson, there's words highlighted and a similar set of tasks where you can match the pictures or the definitions, write your own definitions. There's then some retrieval questions on moonbeams and white and waves. There's answers provided, and of course, science teachers could adapt that for different abilities, add, remove information depending on what's already been covered. Pupils will need to know something about each section though. Similar to the English lesson, and then write an analysis, but their analysis is much more scientifically focused. So it consolidates the information that they've kind of retrieved on moonlight and white and waves, and they write a paragraph explaining their knowledge of light and waves to Davy, and kind of the point of that is to get them thinking about the definitions of the words such as white in scientific rather than poetic terms. Can I have the next slide, please, Becky? So the final planned lesson in the resources is English lesson 2, and that brings together the 2 previous lessons. So if you're doing the science English format rather than the science sandwich format, English sandwich science, then this would form the second half of the English lesson, and you can remove the introductory material about Davy because that should have been, you know, covered enough in the science lesson. The activities in this lesson again are quite straightforward, but I found that the key to making them go well is to keep making the connections to the previous lessons clear and prompting the students to return to their work, the previous lessons throughout. That is one of the real challenges in blending the science and the English, because sometimes once back in an English lesson, the pupils kind of put their English hats back on and they forget to think about the scientific definitions, unless they're specifically reminded about them at the start of each task. There's another video reintroducing Davy here that talks more about his sort of literary works, and there's some questions for the pupils to do while they're watching that to kind of keep them focused. If you're short on time or you're doing just 2 lessons, this is one of the things that you can probably drop, but it is actually really helpful for the students. They're then asked to compare the paragraphs that they've written in the English and the science lessons, which might just be the one paragraph. They're then asked to compare the paragraphs that they've written in English and science lessons, which might be the one that they've just written if you're doing just a science and an English lesson. And then we suggest a debate format where they talk about which analysis they think is kind of the most accurate or the best. And there are model answers provided for the English and the science analysis, which they can compare if they don't have their own for whatever reason. There's some prompts to help you generate the discussion and to help the pupils to organise their thoughts. You can actually get a real debate going here, which is great. And I'm sure you all have a range of ways to get your pupils participating in an activity like that. There's also a task that asks pupils what they think Davy wanted them to understand from the poem, which is a slightly different approach. And I think that can be quite interesting, especially for getting your more skeptical science learners on board sometimes. The final task asks students to kind of synthesize your scientific interpretation and your literary interpretation. That sounds like it might be quite difficult for them to do, but I found that when prompted to remember both, they started to do it automatically in the debate. Especially they were less keen to come down on one side or the other, and they were taking kind of bits from each, which is brilliant because that's what we wanted. So that's kind of a whistle-stop tour of the resources. Obviously, when you go through them, they're much more detailed, but yeah, you don't need me to sit through and sit down with you and go through how to go through a lesson plan. So I want to talk a bit about assessing the impact of the resources. So can I have the next slides? Um, so in order to assess the impact of the resources on pupils' attitudes to the relationship between science and literature, we ask, if you use the resources, can you collect some feedback for us? So there's some feedback questions that are built into the lesson plans themselves. So it's a agree, not sure, disagree kind of format. The lesson plans do suggest various ways of asking, but I found the more anonymous ways of asking get better results, or maybe more accurate results. So we did a lot of heads down, thumbs up. Um, we've got some pre-made spreadsheets in the resources for collecting the data. And when they're completed, if you could send them along with any other thoughts or comments, or indeed any other thoughts or comments you have about that session, if you could send them to Sharon, her email's up on the slide. It does really help us to collect impact data. It helps to kind of secure more funding and that kind of thing, so we can kind of keep doing things with the project. My final thing I wanted to say was about adapting kind of the principles of the resources. So I've got some ideas on my last slide. Um, so the resources can be used to look at other texts and other parts of the science curriculum, I think. So that idea of bringing what they're learning in English and what they're learning in science together. So for A-level students doing Frankenstein, for example, close reading certain passages, either with Davy's notebooks in mind or with a scientific focus on the vocabulary, similar to what we're doing with the poem and the white and the foaming, could actually be really useful. If there's strong overlaps between the scientific context in a text and something on the science curriculum, and you have a good relationship with your science department, it might be worth exploring if the timing of teaching those ideas could be coordinated. So something like Never Let Me Go, and if cloning is on the science syllabus, you can kind of match those up a bit. That could be helpful. And I also think that using scientific ideas and concepts in creative writing, so having something quite scientific as a prompt, might not only have the potential to enhance the writing, but it could help pupils to consolidate and understand the scientific ideas. And that might help them then through their science exams. Yeah, so that's my tour of the resources done.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was a brilliant tour. I was writing notes as you were going, so sorry, I'm just sort of pulling my head out from that. Rebekah, I wondered if there was anything else you kind of wanted to add about your experience of delivering these in the schools, sort of any extra kind of tips or tricks or observations or cool things that the students did that you didn't expect or that teachers did that you didn't expect, equally that you might share with us.
Well, one of the students came up with this really cool and interesting analysis of the poem from a scientific perspective that wasn't anything to do with the science that we were working on. It also was science kind of that Davy wouldn't have known about, but I love that because that kind of chimes with my own academic research. Anyway, so it was something to do with radiation and a test for a certain kind of radiation. They use gold as a blocker, and with the gilding and the waves and things moving through things and not moving through things. And it was really good. And then she was like, I don't think that's what he meant though. Which of course he didn't mean. And it was like, but is it an interesting way to think about the language? And it was kind of developing that, trying a theory of interpretation and seeing how it works, rather than going for something a bit more obvious. And that was really exciting for me. One thing I would say was it was really important to have as well, to have some collaboration between the English and the science departments kind of before giving the session. That for me was kind of key to making it work. Those two camps kind of needed to be talking to each other. But yeah, it was a great experience, to be honest. They came up with lots of ideas that did surprise me.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And it really struck me when you were talking about your last slide, Rebekah, that the kind of intellectual sort of dexterity and flexibility that the students demonstrate in doing that kind of putting one hat on and then another hat and then actually both hats kind of at the same time is really impressive. And I just wondered if actually either of you have had any kind of feedback on that kind of their experience of that relationship between themselves as English thinkers and science thinkers. Yeah, I'm just curious.
Yeah, when I was speaking to a lot of the pupils, they did tend to describe themselves as, like, oh, I'm more of a science, I'm more of a science person, or more of a maths person. Or, oh yeah, I'm really an English person. I don't like the science very much. There did seem to be this kind of divide already present in the way they thought about themselves. So then actually to see them kind of bringing the concepts together was really interesting. And I think kind of maybe the more we can do that and kind of break down those disciplinary borders, because I think there's a lot that so science exams do require English skills. You have written answers. And I think bringing those things together so students don't necessarily think of themselves as, oh, I'm just science here, I'm just Englishy. Because I think when you break it down, actually there's topics that all students have something they enjoy in science and something they enjoy in English and maybe something they don't like as much. And I think this helps them to kind of think about those different bits that make up the subject as well. But yeah, it is really interesting how when you sit them down in an English lesson, the stuff they've done in science, which is technically also English, just kind of went out the window until you kind of remind them. That was really interesting.
Yeah, I wonder if it would be quite interesting to ask them to do the English lesson in the lab and the science lesson in the English classroom, or do them both in a drama studio or outside and kind of see what effect that has. Yeah, sorry, Sharon, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go on.
No, I was just going to say, David. I mean, Davy was interested in both, wasn't he? And it wasn't the same kind of. So he wouldn't. The word scientist hadn't even been coined when Davy was around, and it wasn't until 1833. So he would have called himself a natural philosopher, and he thought that encompassed everything. Like it kind of, it didn't. He didn't need to kind of be so specific about what he was interested in. And just the fact of his all of his friends being from all different walks of life, and Coleridge being really interested in chemistry and in poetry, and I think it's just too easy now to think that you're one thing or the other, and it's a shame because you're losing so much in doing that. I think it's a shame to hear that kids are being forced into one or the other as well.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, that's a sort of a good moment to kind of turn to the chat. Your mention of Coleridge. I saw that Liz has just posted in the chat to say that she has a poem published in her book about the relationship between Davy and Coleridge, written in Davy's voice, which is cool. So that's Troublesome Cattle, published by the Poetry Business in Sheffield. And then Liz asks, what about getting the students to write a poem themselves? Is that something that you could kind of fold into either of these lesson plans?
I think that's a brilliant. Sorry, Sharon, I've started
No,
talking over you again.
you mentioned it, didn't you, at the end? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant idea. Getting them to write a poem. I think that could easily be folded into either the end after the debate. And yeah, even on a slightly different topic of science or something. And yeah, I think that's a brilliant idea. I think that would actually really enhance the resources. So thank you for that.
I've just Googled it already, so I didn't know about it, which I should have done, and that sounds really fascinating. I guess one of the things I was going to mention was that when we tested these resources out, somehow it seemed as if the science classes, the people in them were a bit more flexible in their thinking about things, and then when you did the English classes, when the English classes were just faced with a poem, they just saw it as a poem and they didn't kind of like Rebecca said, they had to be reminded about all this kind of stuff that they'd done before, and that's interesting in itself, that we somehow have kind of shut down things in particular spaces or whatever. Maybe like Becky's saying, you should do a poem in a lab, and science in the drama studio, wherever.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting. Actually, there's a project that we've been doing in the EA called Connecting English and Maths, which is about trying to find sort of common ground between English and maths. And we did a survey where we asked lots of teachers of both English and maths, how do you collaborate? And do you collaborate, in fact? And one of the things that most people said who responded, which was really interesting, was we would love to, but we can't find a space where we come together to do that kind of cross-curricular thinking. So I just wondered if you'd had any kind of advice or observations from when you were testing out these resources of teachers who have managed to do that kind of cross-curricular work in their school or college.
We certainly heard about people who weren't able to. Is that right, Rebecca? You had kind of feedback.
Yeah, a lot of the feedback was sort of struggling to kind of bring those two things together. And like there's practical considerations, like the same group of kids that form the English class are not necessarily the same group of kids that form a complete science class. So there's practical considerations around things like timetabling, and that kind of thing, which I think make it quite difficult. When I went into the school, the English and the science teacher were working quite closely, but again, due to timetabling, we only had kind of one of them at a time. So the English teacher was there for the English lesson, and the science teacher was there for the science lesson. And obviously, I was delivering both of them, so it didn't interrupt it that much, I don't think, for the students, but it did mean that they weren't able to kind of work together on it in the same way. And I think having both of them in the same space would actually have really enhance things for the students, and they'd have been able to see those perspectives maybe a bit more. But again, that's something you've got to have two teachers to teach one class. That's a difficult consideration. So a lot of the things around it are practical, and I mean, part of overcoming them is identifying them, isn't it? But I'm honestly not sure I would suggest. I'm not, because I'm not a teacher and I don't work in schools very often, so it's that kind of every school has their own kind of logistical issues around it, and I think it needs to be sort of approached on a case by case basis. But I think if it's something that teachers really want to do, and there's the wider support within the school for them to do that, I think it's something that they could find really, really beneficial.
And one thing we had with the transcribers was that they just loved Davy because of the kind of range of stuff that they found in the notebooks. And so I had people who were, you know, in their 60s saying, I always really wanted to do English and I was never allowed to do it. And now here I am transcribing poetry. And it's kind of interesting, isn't it, that they've got through their whole lives. I remember someone telling me about her dad making her become a banker or something like this. And, you know, so you got to know a little bit about the volunteers who helped you. And there were all these stories of people who kind of were finding that they were able to go back and think about something that they'd enjoyed years and years before and not been able to do.
And I was certainly made to choose in school. I remember that quite clearly. It just wasn't possible with the timetable when you were making your choices. Like it was obviously at GCSE because you've got your core subjects, but at A level, your English lessons and your science lessons were just timetabled at the same time because they assumed you wouldn't be taking both. So yeah, there's structures like that which kind of make it difficult as well.
Thank you. We've got lots of interesting things coming through in the chat, and it's a lot of people kind of echoing this idea that the divide is very real in the experience of students, but actually it's a complete illusion in the intellectual sense, you know, that these disciplines are actually deeply interconnected, and it's a sort of modern invention to force them apart. So it's really interesting that we all seem to kind of share that understanding. And Phil has just come in to say that he thinks a big issue is that for English, the language exam does not come over as poetry friendly as the writing part is focused on story writing, while the literature exam has students reading other people's poems, not writing their own. Yeah, so creating a space where both can happen would be amazing, which is a really good point. So I'm just going to sort of take a bit of a sidebar just to note, Phil, you might find it interesting to look at Tommy Karshan's work at UEA, where he's doing a lot of work with schools about recreative writing and kind of how you use sort of writing and rewriting to explore things sort of across curricula and across time in English as well. So I just thought I would lob that in there. Tommy Karshan, yeah, I'll pop it in the chat for you. Yeah. So while I do that, Rebecca and Sharon, is there anything else that you kind of wanted to pull out?
I think maybe just to emphasize just how important I think this might be, you know, kind of And for a number of reasons, I suppose. Like English literature is not people. Lots of kids are going into STEM subjects. Lots of women are going to STEM, which is great. But it's not like there's lots of people coming into English, and I feel like building the bridges between them, and maybe people see that don't need to be divisions so much as we expected. And certainly, like I imagine lots of like sciences would work quite well with English as a subject, even at university or whatever. So I guess there's that. I'm reading that from Helena. I'm an ex-doctor now, heading up English learning, so I love this. I just feel like is really important because the wicked problems they're called, aren't they? The big problems in our world, climate change and the rest of it. They need all sorts of different viewpoints to kind of address them. And you know, I always remember someone saying about kind of recycling and things like that, that a lot of that is behavioral and kind of, so you need all kinds of different people with different expertise. And I mean, that was what the transcription project did as well. People came with all their different skill sets and expertise and things and brought it to bear on this one object. And I just feel like, yeah, this is important stuff and that we need probably to bring people together in these endeavours if we're going to do good in the world.
Wow, Sharon, that's yeah, I can't quite follow that. But I did just want to point out what Liz is saying in the chat that she's been working as a poet towards a widening of the idea of translation being not just language to language, but all other parameters. So this could translate science into a poem and a poem into a piece of scientific prose. And she's going to do a workshop on this with Norway, which is the National Association for Writers in Education, in November. So, Liz, if you want to send me information about that, I will tell everybody who has been on this call, so we can get them all along to that workshop as well.
And do include Davy.
Presumably, you guys just want to see Davy everywhere. The more
Yeah.
Davy, the better. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the nitrous oxide, the unfinished nitrous oxide fragment would probably be a really good one for.
Yeah. Yeah, he writes a poem about his taking nitrous oxide for the first time. So that's quite a good one to do
Yeah,
with.
as he's taking it, he's writing the poem, which is
Yeah. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Okay, well, then I will use this opportunity to bring us to a close. And I've got thank yous to give. So to Rebekah and to Sharon for sharing your time with us this afternoon. I'm really grateful for that. But also to everyone who has joined us this afternoon to share your thoughts and ideas with us in the chat. We're really grateful for that. So I will share the recording with you and Rebekah and Sharon's slides, and Sharon's email address is in there, so you can always hit her up with any questions that you have afterwards. So one final thank you to you all. Enjoy a lovely evening, and thank you very much.
Thank you,
Bye.
Becky.